Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Liyana Gafoor, your host from the Energy Market Authority of Singapore. Thank you for joining us at the SIEW Energy Insights Webinar. We bring you the latest perspective on key issues facing the energy sector in the run-up to the Singapore International Energy Week, or SIEW for short. SIEW 2020 will feature a hybrid format which comprises of on-site events combined with live streaming for attendees who are unable to join us in person. Today's webinar, The Big Switch, Scaling Up Low Carbon Energy Solutions, is held in partnership with the Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore, organisers of the SIEW partner event, Asia Clean Energy Summit. Before we begin, let's take a look at the results from our poll. There's quite a number of you from academia, clean energy, consultancy, quite a handful from organisations and associations, and others. In terms of the region, majority of us are from Asia, a handful from Europe and Oceania. We have also triggered another poll, and the results will be showed during the panel discussion later. If you would like to pose a question at any time during the webinar, please use the Q&A tool. Let us know your name, organisation, and if the question is posted to any of the speakers here today. We would now like to invite Mr. Dolf Gielen, Director of the IRENA Innovation and Technology Centre, International Renewable Energy Agency, who will share the ASEAN Energy Transition Outlook. Mr. Gielen, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction, and hello to everyone. Can we move to the next slide, please? So we conduct every year a global renewable energy outlook, and that looks at developments with policies in place and at energy transition pathways. And as part of that analysis, we also do dedicated analysis for ASEAN. And what we see is that today the share of renewables in primary energy is around 18%, but with policies in place it will already double to 39%, and we see a potential that renewables become the major source of energy, with 3/4 being renewables by 2050. So renewables will grow very rapidly and can become the dominant source of energy. What is important in that context is that the renewables are combined with a high energy efficiency, and that also that a lot of the final energy demand in buildings, industry, and transport is electrified. So it's these three elements together that make for an energy transition. And we're currently further elaborating that in combination, in cooperation with the ASEAN Center for Energy for ASEAN and deep dives for Malaysia and Indonesia. Next slide, please. So power sector transformation is really at the center and is the first step of this energy transition. And we see a potential that renewables become soon the primary source of electricity in the region, as it is already in other parts of the world. But that will require also a lot of investments. We see investment needs in clean energy of around $140 billion per year on average between now and 2050. Next slide, please. Now, to enable high shares of renewables, and especially variable renewables, solar and wind, in the power system, we need to have sufficient flexibility in these power systems. So it's not only about adding generation capacity, but there's also attention needed for these grids. And we see 4 dimensions in that. Of course, we need additional technology, such as, for example, interconnectors, And in that sense, it's interesting to see what's going on in the region. But it's not only technology. We also need the right market design and regulations. We need the right system operation practices, and we need the right business models. And there are many innovations ongoing in these four dimensions, and you need to apply a mix of these innovations to enable this renewables integration. Next slide, please. Now, why would you move to renewables? So, of course, there are environmental reasons, but perhaps a more compelling reason right now is that the economics are very favorable. So we have seen significant cost reductions for solar PV and for both onshore and offshore wind in recent years. And we foresee that these cost reductions will continue in the coming years. So this changes the whole discussion about renewables. Next slide, please. So according to our latest cost numbers that we released in May, there is a paradigm shift in a sense that the PV and wind are cheaper than new coal in more than half of the cases we looked at, and increasingly these renewables are even cheaper than just the operating cost of existing coal plants. So that will that gives a solid economic basis to an accelerated transition to renewables in power generation. Next slide, please. Now, what does that mean for the region? If you look at the cost trends for ASEAN and compared to the global cost trends, you see that also in ASEAN there is a cost reduction trend. You see for solar PV on the right that the costs are close to the global averages, but you see for wind on the left that there's still quite a significant gap. So, and this of course then plays into the economic analysis. So for solar PV, we see for 2019 cost gap of around 2 cents. ASEAN is slightly higher, but for wind it's still a cost gap of about 4.5 cents. Offshore wind is not yet deployed in the region. That's another technology where we see very rapid cost reductions, and for example in Vietnam that can also play an increasing role. Next slide, please. So if we increase the renewable share in electricity generation, the next step in a transition is then to use more of that electricity in buildings, industry and transport. And electromobility has really a key role to play there. It's important from an energy and climate perspective, but also from an air pollution perspective in cities. So that is now receiving increasing attention in the region. We are closely looking at how to integrate electromobility, electric vehicle charging with renewable power. And there are interesting opportunities for smart charging. And for example, we're now working with government of Thailand to assess what the opportunities are, and that will also be taken to an ASEAN context. So electrification, transport important, also in industry, interesting opportunities based, for example, on hydrogen, and of course also in clean cooking. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, it's important to consider the latest cost numbers and the latest potential numbers for renewables in doing assessments, because the costs continue to fall very rapidly. It's important to pay sufficient attention to power system flexibility, and then as a next step, electrification of end users. And in the post-COVID recovery, there is because it's important to consider energy transition as a key pillar. That concludes my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gielen. For those who would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A tool. Let us know your name, organization, and if the question is directed to any of the speakers. It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Justin Wu, Head of Asia Pacific from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, who will present on renewable energy in Asia after COVID-19. Mr. Wu, please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. I want to thank also the organizers of SIEW and ACS for having me again. It's really a pleasure to be back. I think often that 2020 has been a really long year for all of us. I still can barely remember where we were at the beginning of the year. But one thing that I like to remind everyone is that 2020 was, or is rather, the beginning of a new decade and the end of a previous decade. And this is a decade, I think, that was highlighted by a lot of progress and changes that we saw in the renewable energy industry and the sector. So what I want to do today is actually present a little bit on where we got to at the beginning of 2020 with regards to clean energy, and what can we expect actually after, especially after COVID-19 in the coming 5 to 10 years. So next slide, please. So actually in the last decade, what many of us probably don't realize is that renewable energy capacity out-installed all other technologies in the world. So in terms of when people chose what power technologies to build, solar was the most popular one, as you can see here, from at 638 gigawatts. Wind was also not far behind. If you look at coal, which was actually right below solar, the vast majority of that was built in China, and the rest of the world actually saw not a whole lot of coal increase. So actually, the last decade was already quite a boon for renewable energy, especially solar and wind. Next slide, please. And of course, cost is something that drives everything. We also saw this in the previous presentation from IRENA. In the last 10 years, we saw fairly dramatic cost decreases for generation technology, especially solar and also both onshore wind and offshore wind. The learning rates for solar photovoltaics was about 28%. In other words, a 28% fall in levelized cost of electricity for every doubling of capacity. Even for lithium-ion battery, also saw a dramatic decrease of 18%, and also 11% for onshore wind. I think this story might be familiar for many of us here today if you've been following the renewable energy industry, but it's still noteworthy to see just how far we've come in the past decade. Next slide, please. And this has obviously taken us to a point where the vast majority of the world now has renewable energy as its cheapest option when deciding what power generation technologies to build. Specifically, in 2019, about 2/3 of global population, 72% of GDP, or 85% of electricity demand has wind and solar as its cheapest new generation technology. Now, notably, actually, if you look at the Asia Pacific region, outside of India and China, coal still is the most, or rather the cheapest power generation technology, especially across Southeast Asia, Korea, and Japan. However, in the next 5 years or so, we see this changing as well. So we're really, in this decade at a point where even for the rest of the Asia Pacific region, we can see renewable energy beginning to scale. Next slide, please. And actually, one of the, I think, the most interesting indicators of the adoption of renewable energy around the world is what corporations or what companies are doing. So this is the membership in the RE100. So these are companies that voluntarily pledge to use 100% renewable energy for their operations by a certain year. And we saw that, as of last month or 2 months ago, there were about 242 members in the RE100, and that's a pretty dramatic increase over the last 5 or 6 years. Notably, actually, about a few weeks ago, we saw that TSMC, which is the largest semiconductor company in the world based in Taiwan, also joined the RE100 and committing to 100% renewable energy use. So we see that although this trend mostly started with corporations in the US and also in Europe, it's spreading slowly and surely to Asia, especially the supply chain companies in Asia, which supply to many of these RE100 members based in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. And at the same time, actually, this has had an impact on countries in Asia which rely on manufacturing, especially manufacturing to supply many RE100 members. So Vietnam, for instance, for a very long time within ASEAN is probably the fastest growing power market in terms of electricity demand. It's also very reliant on coal and also has factories and supply chains that supply a lot of companies. We see that, for instance, in its latest electricity development plan, which is not yet released but currently under discussion, we see the renewable energy is becoming a lot more actually ambitious in terms of the Vietnamese government's goals for the future. So it's no longer only a story about more coal or gas, but actually solar and wind are going to play an increasingly important role in Vietnam's future power mix. Next slide, please. Of course, we can't really talk about anything this year without actually mentioning COVID-19. So I think it's important to think of COVID-19 actually in maybe two stages. So one is, what happened initially right after the lockdown? What was the impact on power demand or renewable energy in our region after the lockdown? And then a slightly longer term view in terms of, the government or the company or corporation response to the lockdown or to the longer implications of COVID-19. So if we take a look at the first part of this, which is what happened immediately after lockdown, this is power demand in different countries in Asia. And we've actually interestingly observed two somewhat diverging trends. So India obviously has currently had a major impact as a result of the pandemic, had an initial lockdown, and we saw actually a very large drop in electricity demand in India for the first few months of this year. We do expect that to bounce back in the next couple of years as growth returns. But for the moment in 2020, it's been hit relatively hard. And that's actually also the case for many of the emerging developing markets in Asia as well, such as including those in Southeast Asia. But on the other hand, countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia, even though they've seen a decline in demand, the reason it's not necessarily COVID related, it was actually much more related to weather impacts in three countries. Different reasons, but nevertheless, it wasn't so much of a COVID lockdown. So, even though we can say that COVID has an impact, it's not sort of the end-all be-all in this situation. But the question is, with power demand falling, what happened to the power generation mix in these countries? So next slide, please. What's really interesting here is actually that even as power demand fell, we saw that coal power was squeezed the most. So on the left-hand side, you can immediately see what happened after India's lockdown earlier this year in March, that essentially demand fell and generation fell along with it. But actually it was coal power that was hit the hardest, or squeezed the hardest. Renewable energy was actually still generating at higher than normal levels after the lockdown. And similarly, in Malaysia on the right, even though Malaysia at the moment does not generate a lot of renewable energy, we also saw that coal, due to its sort of less flexibility, was also cut the most as a result of a slowdown in electricity demand. Next slide, please. We take a look at slightly the longer term impacts of this, so post lockdown, but sort of the second part of this. I think there's a few things to think about. One, first of all, if you look at renewable energy, we sort of developed three scenarios for thinking about the pandemic. Quite simply, a scenario one is a single wave pandemic, essentially one hit and we're in the clear. Scenario two is a multi-wave pandemic, which the pandemic comes back in waves. And then an enduring pandemic, which basically means that things would sort of keep going until we can see a vaccine. I think at the moment, unfortunately, we're somewhere between scenario 2 and 3. But even so, as you can see from here, wind and solar, even with this initial hit with the pandemic, we see it recovering essentially from next year. So the longer term impact of the pandemic on wind and solar build might be quite short-lived and limited to 1 or 2 years, and we'll see recovery after that. Next slide, please. However, one relatively more uncertain area is companies and how companies will respond. Oil companies were a major driver or investor in clean energy prior to the pandemic. But as you know, with oil prices dropping dramatically this year, in some cases to negative prices due to a fall in demand, we're already seeing sort of significant announced capital expenditure cuts among some of the global oil majors. And you can also see that clean energy deals by the major oil majors have basically dried up in the first quarter of this year. So the longer term implications of this are still unknown, but obviously this is low oil prices are going to have an impact on whether oil companies can sort of continue to do deals in this area. Next slide, please. The good news is that corporate sustainability seems to remain on track. So RE100 commitments seem to be on track this year. More companies are joining the RE100. Also, another metric, science-based target commitments have also been quite high this year. We think in this case, for a lot of companies, they see sort of the move towards sustainability and clean energy as more of a long-term strategic shift that sort of goes beyond this pandemic. So that's a promising sign, but of course, we'll have to still see how this plays out. Next slide, please. And the final point, of course, is really how we respond, right? I think we know the impact of the pandemic, the short-term effects, and some long-term resiliency in clean energy. But what we don't know is how companies, but also how governments will respond. So as of now, there's about $54 billion in green stimulus announced by most governments of the world. The majority of it is actually focused on electrified transport and mobility, which is probably not a surprise given that the automobile sector was hit the hardest and is seen as a way to restore the economy. So, that is really getting a lot of support from governments. And a lot of that is primarily in Europe, 60% of it in Germany. We're watching closely how governments in Asia are responding, but so far outside of China and actually South Korea, there hasn't been any, explicit mentions of green stimulus sort of within governments in Asia or in ASEAN specifically. So I think this will be an interesting area to watch, and it's obviously still very much developing. And in many ways, this is sort of how we build back is going to matter a lot in terms of how we see the clean energy sector develop over the coming decade. So thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Wu. We would now like to welcome back Mr. Gielen and Mr. Wu for the panel discussion. Also joining us for the discussion is Ms. NIRUPA CHANDER, Country Managing Director, Singapore, Hitachi ABB Power Grids. Moderating this session is Ms. Nessa Anwar, Multimedia Journalist, CNBC International. Once again, for those who would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A tool. Let us know your name, organization, and who the question is addressed to. I will now hand over the session to Nessa. Nessa, please.
A very good day and welcome back to the second segment of the webinar session organized by the Singapore International Energy Week. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in so far virtually from your homes or offices. My name is Nessa Anwar. I will be your moderator for the panel that's going to be happening in just a few moments. The speakers include a varied group of analysts and directors who will be able to shed valuable insight into the energy conversation that's bringing us all here today. So the three presenters that we've just heard from earlier will be joining us virtually, Mr. Frank Puan, Mr. Dolf Gielen, and Mr. Justin Wu. And here with us in the studio is Ms. NIRUPA CHANDER from Hitachi ABB. So it is a multi-platform experience happening today, and we just hope that the tech gods will bless us plentifully with great Wi-Fi service. So thank you for joining us, speakers, and we look forward to hearing your input. So during this timely discussion on scaling up low-carbon energy solutions and what that entails for us and our businesses, I'd like to invite everyone to submit their questions in the Q&A box provided, and I will do my best to get to them proper in the next 50 minutes. So in the meantime, before I kick off the session proper, I'd like to get to the poll questions. So earlier at the very start, viewers were given 5 pop-up poll questions to vote on, and the results are in. So let's dive right in. Question number 1, COVID-19 has positively impacted the advancement of the ASEAN energy transition. So 46% said yes and 41% said not sure. Actually, this is a very interesting question, and I'm not at all surprised by the results, because given that according to the International Energy Agency, renewables are the most resilient energy source during the pandemic, and with the usage of renewables globally increasing by 1.5% in the first quarter of 2020, compared to the same period in 2019. So second question, ASEAN markets should pursue net zero emission by 2050 target. So 81% of us said yes, while reductions in carbon emissions are slated to be achieved by 2030. So I guess the 2050 goals, 81 of us think that we should be meeting that. Question 3, gas and LNG, liquefied natural gas, in this case methane, will continue energy transition fuel beyond the next 10 years. 86% of us said yes. Question number 4, Singapore can source renewables from ASEAN connected grid in the next 10 years. Well, an international power grid has many variables and factors, and I will jump off from that question into the panel discussion, but I'll just look at number 5. Major fossil fuel suppliers will pivot their strategy to be leaders in the RE space in 10 years. 66% of us said yes, and I think our panelists will have quite a bit to talk about for this question. But just to jump off from the 4th particular poll result, and I will pose the first question to Ms. NIRUPA CHANDER as the Singapore Managing Director for Hitachi ABB Power Grids. Hello, Ms. NIRUPA. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nessa, for having me here today.
Okay, so I will just pose the first question to you. So low-cost carbon solutions or renewable energy solutions, they cannot exist or do not and cannot exist on its own. So do we have the infrastructure integrated in our cities, in the power grids of our cities, to leverage more sustainable options?
Definitely from a technology perspective, we in Hitachi ABB Power Grids have been pioneering sustainable energy for all of our existence. So from a technology perspective, it's definitely possible and is happening right now. We're providing high voltage DC connections, powering, an example is in India, from the northeast, where we're transmitting hydropower to the major consumer centers in northern India, northern central India. These are links over 1,800 kilometers and at 800 kilovolts of high voltage DC voltage levels. Every year we seem to surpass the next level of voltage in these grid connections. So again, from a technology perspective, interconnecting power grids is possible and has been happening over the last several decades already. The question now is, how do you interconnect power grids across countries so that you can optimize and get generation from the right renewable sources where they may be amply available to our consumption centers. And the ASEAN Power Grid is one such example of countries, the ASEAN countries coming together with an ambitious plan. And they've already demonstrated with the link in Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and the first project of 100 megawatts of hydropower being transmitted from Laos to Malaysia through Thailand. So from a technology perspective, this is definitely possible, and companies like ours continue to invest in enabling getting clean power from the right source to the right consumer center. I suppose the major challenge is obviously getting countries, policymakers, the legalities, and obviously the financials to make sense. And I think that's where the most innovation now needs to happen, is in the commercialization and coming together of governments to make it happen.
Jumping off from that innovation point, and I'd like to pose this question, thank you for that, by the way. I'd like to pose this question to the rest of our speakers as well. So what about the resilience of these power grids? Because I'm sure that it's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing for all the power grids, right? So maybe we can hear on the research and development done on power grids to withstand disruptions like extreme weather conditions, or even power disruptions or overloading.
Yeah, I guess I'll take that question. So yes, there's definitely been a lot of research and development and innovation happening in this space. Microgrids and energy storage is one such example, where today battery storage technology is enabling grid resilience and reducing the problem of intermittency with renewables. And with the price curve coming down, as Justin and Dolf previously showed, it is becoming increasingly competitive to start putting in these solutions together. So again, from a technology perspective, from an innovation perspective, there's a lot happening. And yeah. I'll leave it at that for the others to comment.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a few questions that's coming in from our viewers. There's one directed to Dolf. Dolf, there's a lot of data and reports on solar and wind energy, but what about anaerobic digestion, waste, and energy solutions?
Yeah, so bioenergy is clearly also a key component for the future energy supply in the ASEAN region. In terms of biogas, it's of course an interesting component as part of the clean gas mix. Biogas for power generation is generally a bit more expensive than solar PV and wind, but of course it has the advantage that it's a dispatchable form of renewable power. So it can indeed help to integrate these variable renewables, and in that sense it can play a role. But we see definitely significant growth also for biogas.
Thank you for that. And I see that Mr. Frank Kwan from SunSeep has just joined in. Thank you so much for dialing in. So with that, I'd like to pose the next question to Frank, actually, in the interest of research and development. So given that workspaces and workplaces all over the world right now are going through a state of flux and, some even working from home revamp, has this affected any scaling up of productivity or research and development in your company?
Sure, happy to share that. First of all, thank you organizers for bearing with me because I had to dial in late with my earlier speaking session on another Zoom call. So I think the the pandemic situation has forced a lot of us to work from home. And I can say in terms of productivity that from an employer's perspective, that is really not ideal, right? But it has also given us opportunity to do things that we have not tried before as well. So I recall, I think over the circuit breaker period, right? Maybe I'll just share two stories from my end. We actually did an M&A deal, right, with our Japanese partner. And I think because that is also standing on the foundation that we had done previous work, and we managed to close that deal. We couldn't fly to Japan, obviously, but we will close the deal and then do a lot of knowledge transfer across daily and weekly Zoom chats to our Japanese colleague, who then went on to do business development in the Japanese market. All right, so all that is possible because we have already established some sort of trust with a partner or potential partner on the ground. So I think in terms of this pandemic situation, if you have the realistic thing on the ground is if you already have established somebody who is trustworthy, I think expansion can continue. All right. On the work from home perspective, I think like I mentioned earlier, productivity is actually much lower. All right, but it also presents itself a reset button, a reset opportunity for us. So what happened, another story is we had an opportunity to actually do installation during the circuit breaker period because we are labeled as an essential service, right? So one of the projects that we had, which is the one, a floating PV project in between Singapore and Malaysia, we were given a green light to continue installation. But in that, we don't have any foreign workers nor any labor to do the installation for. All right. So what happened? I actually opened up to the office and say, any volunteers from the office who would like to go down on site and actually do installation with your own hands. So we gather about 20 over office people. These are not your blue collar, but your engineers, your system designers, even your finance. There are ladies involved as well that go on site to do this installation, right? So, and the idea sprang upon to us, could we then rely less on foreign worker labor and rely more on local labor to reset ourselves during this pandemic situation? All right, so hence the idea of now moving ahead, we are actually encouraging majority of our contractors to use local labor. All right, this also helps to reduce unemployment as well. In this reset situation, it presents itself new opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Mr. Frank. Let's talk about cost. You mentioned that with local labor being used and less focus on foreign labor, we might see a better cost in workplaces. So let's talk about how renewable energy is getting cheaper. So this question is directed to Mr. Wu, Justin. So especially in solar power systems, we're seeing that it's getting more affordable, especially with individuals opting to power their homes with solar energy. And well, solar panels are definitely cheaper than building your own dams, right? So in your own expertise, have you seen that, or can we expect renewable energy options as a whole to be more affordable generally across countries?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think costs always come up as discussion. I mean, to clarify, where the charts and the numbers I showed earlier, and I think what also Dolf was mentioning is on utility scale renewable energy projects. These are sort of large scale renewable energy projects that are built, and connected to the transmission grid. Rather than sort of we're talking about rooftop solar or sort of things that people may build in their homes or in industrial commercial sites, which I think Frank is the resident expert on sort of those types of projects. So I think one really simple reason for why, for instance, we see that costs for solar and wind in China, India are cheaper, for instance, is the fact that you can build them at very large scale in those countries. And also you have cheap equipment, right? A lot of the, China manufactures 90% of the world's solar panels and exports a lot of that to India. As a result, we have sort of cheap capital equipment, which drives down costs on other aspects of the project as well. And also, which, allows us to achieve relatively low sort of costs of energy. I did see one question, I think, in the box that from one of the participants, which mentioned sort of assessing costs, in terms of assessing costs of electricity, ignoring what transaction costs. So I'd be interested to hear what that means. I mean, when we talk about levelized costs of electricity, we do take into account it's not only about sort of equipment costs, right? It's also about project financing, the balance of plant, and also what is needed to give a return to the investor at a reasonable rate. But of course, there are different conditions across different countries, and often, barriers to cost are not really the result of technology, but the result of regulation and how projects are paid. So there are definitely different maybe transaction costs or different costs as a result of man-made factors across different countries. But doesn't sort of take away from the fact that the trend of renewable energy is pushing towards lower costs, of course, at different rates in different countries.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think renewable energy, some might say, can be considered like a bespoke concept. Not all countries have the same potential for clean energy. Not all countries harness the same environment for certain infrastructure. So this is open to all panelists. We're seeing a question on the difference between ASEAN and Europe with regards to different kinds of renewable energy being harnessed. So what's the magic formula for countries in ASEAN when you compare it to countries in Europe?
Oh, happy to take that one. So what we are beginning to see increasingly is the whole concept of VPPA, or there are many names to this, right? Virtual power purchase agreement, or there's an offsite arrangement, or there's a corporate PPA, but they are all referring to the same thing, whereby a developer looks into developing solar system in one location, wheel it through the grid, right? So they work with the incumbent grid operator, and then sell the green energy to a different customer in a different location. So in Singapore, we have done this with the likes of Apple, Microsoft. Hopefully we'll sign more RE100s coming along the next couple of months. But we see a lot of this happening across Asia, all right? In Vietnam, they have already opened up and approved the policy for this corporate PPA, which we believe will lead the next phase, right? Because some of the earlier programs like the FIT, the feed-in tariff programs, right? There's always a perspective that a feed-in tariff is basically everybody is being taxed, and then that money is put together and then money is given to the corporates who has the capability to develop projects like this, then it's seen as a form of subsidies. All right, so from various point of view, I think the FIT can be regarded as some form of incentives or subsidies whose money is put by everyone, right, including the rich and the poor. So there is some, I would say, from the people who are less privileged, they will say, hey, why is money being put from me to benefit the rich or the corporates, right? But in doing this corporate PPA, whereby developers like ourselves find customers directly, all right, and then continue to pay the wheeling charge or the grid charge to the necessary grid operator, I think that takes away that perspective. All right, take away the whole idea of it is being incentivized. And today, in many parts of Asia, actually, solar has already reached grid parity. All right, so there is in Singapore particularly, all right, we have already hit the not just the retail parity, but wholesale price parity. All right, so wholesale price today, prior to COVID situation, we are talking about 10 cents, 9 cents. All right, now 6 cents. I think this is after COVID. I think the oil dropped drastically, and then we have a crash in the market price. But I think this is who can say that it will last at 6 cents for the next 20 years. So another benefit, of course, that solar or the renewables are being able to bring is the price of the tariff and fix it for the next 20 years, right? This is something oil and gas can do, right? So renewables can do this, right? So for example, solar, we are able to lock in a price through a corporate PPA, right, to a customer and lock it down for the next 20, 30 years. Yeah.
Thank you. We're seeing please, Dolf, go ahead.
Thank you. Maybe to add to that, it's looking at the difference between Europe and ASEAN. I mean, I think the European countries were a little bit earlier in establishing the enabling policy framework and visibility on where the government wants to go, where the countries want to go long term, is really important for investors. And I think what's really changing the situation in ASEAN now is especially this falling solar PV cost. And in ASEAN, of course, cooling is also a key part of electricity demand. And decentralized rooftop PV, which was just mentioned, fits perfectly well with air conditioning. So if you can avoid grids, then that is another major benefit of these decentralized renewables. And in fact, indeed, that is not yet reflected in the LCOE. If you account for that as well, then PV is hands down the most economic option. So it's a complex story. It requires a little bit of rethinking also on the side of the policymakers, but the economic case is clearly there.
If I could just add a quick comment, I see a lot of questions on resources and also, what's different in ASEAN versus other locations. So clearly, as Dolf and Frank both mentioned, there is less wind resources in ASEAN, simply being closer to the equator. A lot of countries will not have that sort of the wind speeds you see in Northern Europe or Northeast Asia. But on the other hand, of course, these are very sunny countries. So solar is clearly a technology with a great amount of potential. But I do want to mention also that I think the resource, I often hear the resource point being made, and I think it's important to make sure that we don't sort of, it doesn't become sort of, we don't become too sort of obsessed with that question. We saw a lot of solar being built in Germany, northern Germany, and northern Europe, where it's definitely not very sunny. So solar and wind are in many ways global technologies, and there is a place for them, even in places where resourcing is not significant. There is still a role for them, and I think in ASEAN, I think that for solar, there's definitely a role for it. And then similarly, I think that the points that some of the other participants were making about various forms of bioenergy, I think we could look at them as localized solutions in certain countries in ASEAN. They may not sort of scale in the way that solar would on a global context, because feedstock is very much a local technology or local supply, whereas sort of anything not involving a global feedstock is something that you can, a non-fuel based technology such as wind and solar probably has greater potential to scale across the region. So I think it's important to think of these technologies in that context, and also and also I would say not let the resource question sort of get too much in the way of the way we think about potential in ASEAN.
Thank you so much for that. There are a few questions that's coming in on power grids, but before I get to that, I did want to address other renewable energy options other than solar. We talked a lot about solar, about wind. What about solutions like biomethane or green hydrogen? How does that, what's the potential and strategies required to develop these in Southeast Asia and ASEAN?
Well, I'm happy to take on the question about green hydrogen. I think there was also talks about this very long cable that is going to stretch from Australia to Singapore to supply Singapore energy. I think in my opinion, they are better off using the energy generated in Australia to generate green hydrogen and make that as both energy as well as storage. All right. So rather than build a long infrastructure between underwater as well between Singapore and Australia. And of course, if you can actually use abundant sunshine or abundant cheap energy actually to make hydrogen, and then that is easy to use that as a transport anywhere in the world. Don't have to be Singapore, for example, right? So this is also in relation to the cable cost. All right, if you will want to build the infrastructure for the cable between Australia and Singapore, I think it's better, or we are better off building a Southeast Asia grid, right, and interconnect, right? So rather than to pull a cable all the way from Australia. Yeah.
Thank you. Dolf, you had something to say?
Yeah, indeed, the region has a very significant bioenergy potential, and of course countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia have very ambitious biofuel targets. But also hydropower has not yet been mentioned, and that is today the largest source of renewable power in the region. It's a dispatchable form of renewable power, so and for example, hydropower reservoirs can also be used to install solar PV. That's clearly an option we see coming up around the world, and the potentials are quite significant. So there are interesting synergies between all these different forms of renewables, and of course geothermal was also not yet mentioned, which is also particularly important in the region.
Thank you so much. This is a question that, let's talk about the grids now. Do you think that grids in ASEAN NIRUPA are ready for intermittent renewables, and what are the main challenges to deploying these kinds of low carbon solutions compared to Europe and Asia?
That's a really good question, and there's definitely significant investment still required and is being planned as part of the power development plans in the different countries for expanding on the grid infrastructure. Today, from a resource perspective, Vietnam has adequate wind resource, but does it have the capacity to interconnect that wind resource into its existing grid infrastructure is another question. So both sides of developing the clean energy solutions and deploying them is as important as developing your existing grid infrastructure and making it smarter and able to cater to this intermittency and demand. Again, back to the same point, from a technology perspective, it's all possible. So as long as policymakers, regulations, and the money flows into the right investments, it will happen. One example, I mean, Singapore is, you mentioned the Sun Cable project, Frank. Yes, it's a wild idea to connect, from Australia, 10-20% of Singapore's energy demands into Singapore, but it's possible. It's definitely possible from a technology perspective. Whether it's viable, whether hydrogen, using that power to generate hydrogen in Australia and exporting that to the world is better, I don't know. I mean, so that needs to be figured out, I suppose. But again, from a grid infrastructure perspective, there is quite a lot of investment that's still required. And from technology perspective, using storage is key to help with that, and we've seen that in other markets. For example, Australia is a big market for us. We've done nearly 600 megawatts of storage globally now on networks, and the majority of that being in Australia. So yeah, that's again, from a technology perspective, that can be resolved as long as the investment decisions are made and investors can also see a decent return.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, energy plans, they're always working in tandem with businesses and governments. So with that, this question is posed to everyone. What government policy or regulatory impediments does increasing renewable energy or energy efficiency face in Southeast Asia? Justin, do you want to take that question? We're talking about government policies.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think, obviously government, our view is that government policy has a lot to do. Like I said, I think a lot of renewable energy challenges, renewable energy uptake, for instance, in many countries we observed over the last 10 years is relatively man-made rather than sort of technology-based. And I think there's one point to mention that might be interesting, I think, for people just to bear in mind. Often it's relatively easier for a country to go from 0% to maybe 10%, or even in some cases 20 or 30% renewable energy generation, whether it's the impact it has on the grid or on the power market or companies. For some cases it's relatively easier to do that. So if you think about most countries in Asia currently, very low single digits of intermittent renewable energy such as wind and solar, increasing that percentage is not difficult. So that initial push is probably what we should go for, what sort of countries should go for if that's something that they want to do. I think it's when you get above 25, 30, 40%, maybe at some level that gets much more difficult, right? That requires, balancing on the grid, some of the technologies that were mentioned earlier. That requires reforms to your power market structure, figuring out ways to compensate for renewable energy generators at different times of day to maintain stability in the grid. I think all of these sort of examples are, all these issues will emerge once you have a higher penetration of renewable energy in the system. I think it's important to note that, there isn't a single country or power market that has it exactly right in terms of how to integrate a large amount of renewable energy into the system. We do, I think, have a good view of what some of the solutions are in terms of the policies in place. Might be a lot of detail to get into, or we also have a view of what are some of the technologies, whether it's grids, investment in distribution grid, demand side technologies, digitization, energy storage, and other things that I think can help help a grid sort of, help a high sort of renewable penetration grid. So I think there's a view of a variety of solutions that we can consider, that I think countries in the ASEAN region can look towards as well.
Dolf, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Justin. I mean, technology is very important, but we need to have the right market signals. So the prices need to reflect electricity oversupply or scarcity. We need to have the right systems operation practices. So for example, the concept of base load has to go. You don't need base load in your power systems. That's still something I hear a lot in the region. And also the business models need to change. So for example, the direct sales of power, you need to not only have this centralized market system, but also these more decentralized, smarter solutions.
Thank you for that. This question was a jump off from Justin's presentation earlier. So investment in renewable energy was highly dented in 2020, and many countries are already stretching themselves to support their economies against the impact of COVID-19. So do you foresee that investments in low carbon energy solutions will be affected over the next 5 years?
If I could just briefly answer that. Just to clarify, so far in the first half of 2020, investment in clean energy globally has not fallen. It's actually increased about 5% or so year on year from last year, due to a lot of offshore wind projects being built. So just to clarify, investment in clean energy actually has not fallen yet as of sort of the middle of the year, and we think that it's likely to be flat or maybe up a little bit by the end of the year. So yes, there is a bit of a denting, I think, that as a result of COVID-19. But as I mentioned in the presentation, it's more the impact of the lockdown delaying projects being installed and built rather than actually getting rid of them altogether. So things will come back pretty quickly, and then sort of investment activity will sort of pick up from next year. The bigger, I think, potential impact is the companies themselves, right? Especially the oil companies, as an example I mentioned, in terms of some of the companies and their commitment to clean energy or investing in new technologies. I think we don't know how that will play out yet, especially given the economic impact of COVID-19.
Maybe I can add something to that. We are actually in the midst of lobbying, I would say, for Singapore government to accelerate some of these goals, right? So I think the questions revolve around whether the pandemic situation has caused a dent or a decrease in the demand of renewable energy solutions. I think as a whole, we feel that, like what Justin have shared, right, there is a dent purely because of the lockdown, right, across different markets in Asia. But shortly after, we do see a lot of companies and even governments, right, adopting renewable energy solutions, right? Take, for example, Myanmar in the midst of the, I think in the thick of the lockdown period, they launched a 1 gigawatt tender, all right? Malaysia is also looking at a 1 gigawatt LSS, all right, a tender, right? So these are all large-scale tenders being rolled out in this year. And for us, I mentioned that we are lobbying for the acceleration. Why so? Because I believe the renewable economy is the recovery economy, or is one of the recovery economy. It's not magic formula, right? It's been used before. In economic downturn, I think governments look forward to infrastructure development, right? To maintain economy, right? To uplift the economy. In this case, it is the renewable economy. We already have our targets. Our targets are 2030, all right? A lot of things are pegged to 2030 because of the carbon commitment that we have gotten to. But can we accelerate instead of waiting for 10 years, right? So we did some math, right? If we accelerate some of this solar targets, for example, 2 gigawatts by 2030 in Singapore, we could actually, hire 4,000 over people, locals, right? We need to rethink on how to redesign our system so that the locals were willing to take up the job. All right. If we were to accelerate our green mark targets by 2030, again 2030, we have 80% of the buildings in Singapore have to be green mark. If we accelerate those targets, can we hire more people? Yes. I think some math show that we can hire near to 40,000 people doing jobs, right? Just retrofitting lighting, retrofitting HVAC system, chiller systems, right? To get the green mark. In doing so, create the jobs as well. So I think from the jobs perspective, in terms of addressing unemployment, it makes a lot of sense to accelerate the targets instead of looking forward to a dent or decrease in adoption.
Thank you so much for that. Jumping off from government investments or countries' investments in renewable energy, when we're talking about Singapore in particular, Singapore might not have the most ideal environment to harness the more popular renewable energy solutions like solar or wind. What about hydrogen? Is hydrogen viable to power Singapore industries and homes? NIRUPA?
Waiting for a hydrogen question in today's panel session. I suppose, yeah, multiple energy sources are going to be the future, and hydrogen is definitely one of the viable sources of energy. It does require a major amount of capital infrastructure development which of course is possible. It just depends whether the dollars goes towards that infrastructure development. In the short term, we find, like from just looking at a hydrogen perspective, hydrogen's primary use case is in the electrification of transport, or, well, the transport industry, greening of the transport. There, electrifying is definitely a lot easier. So setting up EV charging infrastructure on the back of existing grid infrastructure is definitely a lot easier. And that's something we've been working towards. And, Singapore's also set some aggressive targets to go, rule out the internal combustion engine by 2040. But finally, the final mix of transport in Singapore and other cities would probably end up being a mix of battery technology and also hydrogen technology. I think the speed at which hydrogen comes on board is highly reliant on the development of infrastructure. At the end of the day, hydrogen is an available resource, just not in its primary form. It's clean. We just need to, I suppose, make sure that the investments are going into developing that infra.
Thank you very much. Is there anything from the other panelists? Anything to add? Yes, please, Dolf.
Yeah, I mean, in general, hydrogen is a commodity where the transport costs are very important. It's a very small molecule. It's difficult to transport. And that makes that electrification should be the primary strategy. And also interconnection of the electricity system with neighboring countries should be a primary strategy. Now, for hydrogen, there are interesting opportunities, for example, to use green hydrogen also to produce, say, fertilizer, ammonia, which is ammonia production is a major source of energy use. So, and you can produce iron and steel using hydrogen. And you can do that remotely and then import these green commodities into the region. So I would primarily look at hydrogen from that perspective before starting to think as hydrogen as the first solution.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to another resource question. Well, a lot of renewable energy options. I mean, we are limited by land. We're limited by the infrastructure itself. But how do we tackle this issue? Can we have renewables in the ocean instead, not just for offshore wind, but offshore solar, wave, offshore batteries?
Happy to take on that. We are in the midst of building our offshore solar. All right, this is a project that we have done in between, just off Woodlands in Singapore. So in fact, it is coastal waters, right? I wouldn't say it's really offshore in the deep ocean. But once we complete our project next month, we should be able to demonstrate that this has there's a commercial rationale to do this, not just from R&D perspective, right? So, but I think the bigger issue that we have faced in this offshore solar in Singapore is really finding the right location. Although we are surrounded by waters, right? We spend a lot of time with the agencies to identify a location that is agreeable by all 12 government agencies. It has to be a unanimous decision. So it took about 2.5 years to identify a location like that. So Singapore is a very busy port, all right, and hence a lot of coastal waters, even in the offshore islands, all right, are taken up by various activities, right? Even leisure activities, or you have a very busy port, you have vessels moving in and out. So it's difficult to identify a location. But once, I think we did this project also not to demonstrate that it is possible for coastal PV, floating PV to be viable commercially as well. All right, so Singapore has a wholesale market, right? That the energy price fluctuates every 30 minutes. So how do we use a corporate PPA structure, all right, to reduce the risk on this floating PV, which is pumping power at a wholesale market price? So that's something that we have done. All right, so we want to use that to demonstrate that it is viable and sustainable.
Thank you. Justin and Dolf, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I might just say that, of course, Singapore is a bit of a unique case. I mean, given land constraints. I think for the rest of ASEAN, I would say that, with similar to the resource question, I think it's not for one that we should, become too sort of concerned with. I think there's obviously the land question is raised often. I mean, it's sort of, in Japan and Korea, for instance, it's also a question that gets mentioned a lot. But if you dig in a little bit deeper into the situation, it's, again, a lot of it is regulation and how land is used rather than sort of a physical limitation in terms of the amount of land. So again, I would say that, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia at the moment have relatively low levels of renewable energy development. So I don't think actually in many cases that we have reached a point where land is a constraint for these countries. Having said that, of course, as Frank mentioned, I think floating solar is a technology that is becoming more common across Asia. A lot of countries are looking at it. Often, I think maybe not deployed in the ocean, but actually in lakes or reservoirs or other water sources. So it obviously makes solar more expensive than if you put it on the rooftop or on the ground. But I think that is something, a technology that could be considered as well for countries in Asia.
I think,
sorry, Dolf, please go ahead first.
Maybe to add on the offshore renewables. So floating offshore wind is clearly a rapidly growing emerging technology now, where the costs are also coming down significantly. So that means you can go to water depths of more than, say, 40 meters, which opens up a significant potential. Also, we see that tidal current technologies are picking up. So, which is also an emerging technology, and I think it's also worth a look in the region whether there are potentials.
Yeah, I think I wanted to just make comments around 2 points. So, firstly, digitalization can ensure that you don't necessarily have to have the physical resource or the clean energy in your own network. Renewable energy marketplaces are now available. Singapore Power started the renewable energy credit trading scheme using blockchain technology so that organizations that have targets to buy renewable energy can now use these trading schemes to buy from countries where they're being generated. Not necessarily that those electrons are flowing into my building or consumption location. So that's one. Digitalization will enable this peer-to-peer trading, country-to-country trading using new tech. The second thing is this interconnection of the power grids is going to power without borders. You don't necessarily need to be having those resources. So if Singapore does not have the access to land, but it's not, from a technology perspective, nothing's inhibiting from connecting to, say, Thailand or Laos or Myanmar, where there are plentiful resources, and being able to access that power. So if those projects continue to get developed as per the ASEAN ambitions, then again, that's another way. So digitalization and being able to interconnect are two key ways that you can be independent of where the resource actually is.
Thank you for that. Thank you for also mentioning the ASEAN Power Grid, because we have a couple of questions on that as well. And in the interest of time, I will be combining two of the questions together. So for all panelists, what is the biggest challenge in establishing an ASEAN grid? For example, can we achieve 100% electricity in the rural areas of ASEAN? And how will it be done? Will it be done by decentralized renewable energy or fossil-powered generators?
Yeah, I think the economics make no sense to go with fossil anymore. We saw the numbers with what Justin and Dolf presented today, so it would be really quite sad to see if any more fossil-fired power stations are built in ASEAN. From a decentralization perspective, so we see, as Hitachi ABB, we see two clear trends. The first is interconnecting of power grids across continents, 800 kilovolts DC level getting transmitted all the way across 2 different countries or, the likes. At the other side, you've got decentralized power grids where me in my home in, in Australia or wherever, I don't need to be connected to the grid and I can run into my load independently. So I think those 2 trends are happening, and they're changing the role of utilities, changing the way the markets will operate, and is also going to bring more choice to consumers at the retail end. So yeah, I think that's what I want to say, that there's these 2 key trends which will change the way grids will operate. And in ASEAN, I think we're going to see a mix of both.
Thank you so much. Justin, will you be able to comment on how the rural areas will be affected, how we are going to get electricity to the rural areas?
Sure. Yeah, I think just following up on NIRUPA's point earlier, I mean, I think it's important to understand, I mean, the 2 sort of grid investment opportunities, if you will, in ASEAN. I think on the one side, there's the large-scale inter-country transmission grids that I think many people are mentioning and talking about having good interconnectors between different countries in ASEAN, and then ensuring a stable supply of electricity, and also enabling a switch to cleaner forms of energy. As we see that Europe obviously has good interconnectors across many countries, and that also obviously allows a lot of the countries in Europe to achieve much higher penetration for renewable energy because of this interconnection. And then of course the second piece of this is sort of the smaller grids, or the last mile grids that we need across whether it's remote areas in developing parts of ASEAN or any part of the world that are still not connected to the grid, and that requires sort of electricity access, or just sort of strengthening networks in cities, for instance, because urbanization is a major trend in ASEAN as well, and grids in cities need to be strengthened as well to handle the growing demand. I think just maybe briefly going back to your question about just electrification, I think that we've been looking as well at studies of whether diesel generators is still the best solution, or we should look at solar or batteries or other solutions. And increasingly in many areas, solar and batteries or newer technologies are becoming a more viable option for electrification instead of diesel, right? I think in many cases governments still subsidize diesel fuels, and that obviously helps their sort of use in many rural areas. But I think it's worth looking at that, whether that's something that should continue or we should introduce more renewable technologies for these sort of remote locations or electrification rural areas as well.
Yeah, maybe I can add something there, where we recently provided a proposal. I think not much opportunities for off-grid situations in Singapore, but we found one where we actually offer an off-grid proposal. This is together with solar and ESS, coupled with a backup diesel genset. They already have a diesel genset. So we gave a proposal where we do a long-term PPA to this off-grid, and the price that we offer is actually lower than Singapore Power low tension price, right? So we are in the position, I would say, solar and ESS to power, if you have a stable load 24/7, right, we are able to offer something that is lower than the retail price, or the so-called retail price in Singapore. All right, already we have made that offer. So we will see one successful deployment. I think we will look forward to see how this can enable a lot of rural electrification across Asia. Because as you can imagine, some of the markets, for example, Cambodia, some of the people they are paying in Cambodia, they are way above Singapore SPLD price. All right, some of the industry factories, they are already paying way beyond that price. Can they then go completely off-grid? Right, not just from a perspective of rural electrification, but from a perspective to go completely off-grid because they can. All right. So on the question on ASEAN grids, I think nothing is stopping in terms of technology from the interconnect between countries to countries in ASEAN. Really, in terms of, I believe the biggest challenge would be policies. each market will be concerned how their import of the energy from a foreign country affect their own grid, right? They will be concerned. And there will be also concerns about whether, from a market angle, if I were to use cheap land in certain countries to export energy, is that kind of taking advantage of that resource, right, in that particular country to export that cheap energy? Would it be politically correct to charge cheaper energy outside of what you are generating in the country that you are generating, right? So these are all, I think, issues that have to be ironed out. So it's all policies related than technical related. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Talking about policies, maybe Dolf can answer this question. Are Southeast Asia's energy transition goals ambitious enough? Or should richer countries like Singapore do more for itself and for the region?
Well, I showed that I started with a graph that showed that with policies in place, we think that the share of renewables would double between now and 2050 to around 40%. But if you look at the rising global concerns about climate, that is not enough. We need more. And we see a potential to grow the share of renewables much faster. So there's an economic potential to do that. What we need is the enabling policy frameworks. And so for example, the NDCs for 2030 will be very important in nationally determined contributions to the climate process. These reports or these new policy documents are needed soon. And bringing these climate policy objectives in line with the energy policy objectives is not only in the ASEAN region, but also in many other parts of the world, a main challenge. And we see significant opportunity to raise the ambition level.
What about, there's a question on a comparison between China and India, given that they're both, their size, their potential growth, and, and competitiveness of the energy markets between both countries. So do you feel that there is an increasing need for more regional alignment between the two countries, to effectively replace the energy needs of oil? There's a technical difficulty with my iPad right here. So sorry. Do you feel that there's an increasing need for more regional alignment on energy policy within ASEAN? And how do we achieve this?
Maybe I could say a few words about that. I think, most of companies in the world, whether it's power companies, investors, or the RE100 corporations that want to consume more renewable energy, see ASEAN as probably the most promising area, both in terms of, let me qualify the word promising. I think promising in the sense of, one, there's very strong economic and also power demand growth in the region. Probably arguably outstripping that of India and China at some point in terms of the trajectory. And then secondly, I think promising also in the sense that ASEAN is still the only region in the world that's building, probably outside of China, building more coal than anywhere else. So there is if you will, a decarbonization opportunity for the power sector in ASEAN. So I think that's in some ways without question, as much as we hear about how much renewable energy is being built in India or China, I think ASEAN is viewed as one that's promising in terms of growth potential and what needs to change. I think whether there should be more regional cooperation between ASEAN countries in policy, I think that probably would be helpful especially if it helps the question that we addressed earlier, for instance, to build interconnectors between the different countries to create a regional power system or power market, for instance. I think all of that would definitely be beneficial in terms of helping different countries across ASEAN achieve a higher mix of renewable energy in their mix.
Thank you so much. Are there anything else that the panelists would like to add to that question? If not, I will move on from the ASEAN region, and let's take it to a different scale right now. This question is directed at Frank. What are the challenges for you to bring the Sunseap business to the rest of Southeast Asia and Japan?
I think the majority of the challenges that we face are all regulatory related, to be honest. All right, I think Singapore is fortunate enough. We have an open energy policy where we have, a grid operator and then multiple retailers, multiple generators. We were able to deploy various business models. We have a wholesaler license here. We have a retail license, and the combination of these two licenses and the various permutation of business models allow for off-site PPA to be drafted, right, and enhance the ability to sell directly to customers, clean energy. I think in quite a lot of markets, we have not seen that open up yet. Majority of our neighbors, they are monopolized markets, right? So there's only one grid operator, there's only one retailer, all right? You can't sell as a developer, you cannot sell energy directly to the customers. In some markets, it's even considered illegal to do so, right? So I think regulatory has always been our biggest challenge. But really is how do we work with the regulators, right, or the various authority in the market to expand into that specific market. I'll give two examples, right? One would be like we expanded into China, right? So many will ask, how dare you go to the China to fight against the Chinese, right? They are very competitive. I think the answer is really not to fight against the Chinese, but to collaborate with the Chinese. So we collaborate with a state-owned company there. And through the collaboration with the state-owned company, they brought forth many state-owned relationships with other state-owns. All right, so now we are installing solar systems to power part of their 5G network in the Jiangsu area in China. Right, so this will not be possible if our partner is not a state-owned. All right, so I think it's important to establish that relationship with the various regulatory / people who are close to the regulatory in the specific market. All right. In other markets, like for example in Malaysia, right? We have we are one of those who have, I would say, taken advantage of the FIT in the earlier days. All right. So we have projects that are very, very profitable. FIT, the earlier FIT was highly profitable. But as competition increased, I think we were looking at also the policy change as well. So the FYT dwindled down, right? Of course, there was various change in the government as well, right? So dealing with those government change is something that we have to be flexible about. What worked before may not work in the next couple of years, right? I think it's something to I think keep that in mind in Asia, especially because the government policies do change. So moving ahead, in Malaysia, we decided to collaborate with our Malaysian partner who is also related, I think, to the state, right? So I think that is important. We always try to keep our hearts very close to people who are very close to the grid, either the grid operator or people or companies that are close to the grid. All right, that allow us to keep tabs on what's going on or what is expected to change in the future.
Thank you so much. Jumping off from this conversation on ASEAN, so what about a nuclear power in ASEAN? For example, can advanced small modular reactors be sustainable options for the future? Maybe Justin or Dolf or maybe NIRUPA can take this question.
Sure, maybe I'll say a few words. I'm not an expert in nuclear, but then hear from some of my fellow panelists. First of all, I want to thank the person who asked this question. I think we didn't really mention nuclear energy in our presentations or in this discussion. It obviously has a place in the energy transition if we're talking about scalable sort of low carbon technology or zero carbon technology. I think unfortunately that since the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan about 9 years ago, a lot of policymakers and companies and investors across Asia and the world, actually, for that matter, has been quite shy in terms of investing in nuclear technologies. But, all the things that we've said so far, the forecasts that Dolf and I put forward, even though they're different forecasts, but I think both point to the fact that renewable energy, despite a major increase in wind and solar in the future, it's probably not enough for us to bend the emissions curve towards a 2-degree goal, for instance, as outlined in the Paris Agreement. So we're going to need something else. And then, of course, nuclear has been mentioned as one of these potentials, and specifically the small modular sort of technologies are considered different from the nuclear technologies that the larger scale nuclear technologies we're used to. I think the only thing I can say about that is sort of the technological sort of points aside is that without government or policy support and a political will to do it, it's unlikely that this will be sort of deployed on its own. So I think that's something that policymakers and companies will have to think about, whether this is a technology they would like to promote.
Thank you so much. Dolf, sorry?
And maybe to add one point to what Justin said, and that is that we see that the economics of new nuclear and also small-scale nuclear are nowhere close to the economics of new renewables. So that's also a major factor why that you see that the development of new nuclear is so slow.
Right, thank you so much for that. In the interest of key takeaways, I'd just like to ask a final question. What's one word or phrase that comes to your mind when you envision the energy space in the next 5 years? Or maybe you can relate it back to the theme given by SIEW. Maybe we'll start with you, NIRUPA.
So I think in a post-COVID world, I'd say build back better. So build back a greener grid. Yeah.
Thank you. Frank?
I'll use the phrase greener together, right? We are all greener together. We can't do it alone.
Thank you. Justin?
I don't think I have a catchy phrase, but I think if there's a one takeaway point is that I think a lot more things are more possible than people believe, especially when it comes to renewable energy. And as we mentioned, much of the barriers that we seem to face in renewable energy are man-made rather than technological.
Thank you. And finally, Dolf?
I would say electrification of end use with renewable power.
Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure moderating this panel. We hope you enjoy.
Thank you once again to our speakers, Mr. Dolf Gielen, Mr. Justin Wu, Mr. Frank Puan, Ms. NIRUPA CHANDER, and Ms. Nessa Anwar for the insightful and well-rounded discussion. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank our partner, SIEW, for this webinar. With that, we have come to the end of the webinar. A recording of today's session and presentation slides will be made available on the SIEW website. We would also love to hear your thoughts and experience on the webinar. This can be done by scanning the QR code seen on the screen. We look forward to welcoming you at this year's SIEW 2020 for discussions on this year's theme, Creating Our Low Carbon Energy Future Together, taking place from the 26th to 30th October. Please also indicate your interest to attend SIEW by scanning the QR code displayed on the screen. On behalf of the Energy Market Authority, thank you for joining us at today's webinar and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.